Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Mindful Communication. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant at the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the Nasdaq Center is a nonprofit that's building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. So as you will see in the chat in a moment, the Nasdaq Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you are dialing in from in the chat. We always love to connect. And second, we are going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to all of them. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including Nasdaq, Lehigh University, BMO, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. And so before we get started, we always like to launch just a couple polls to step back, see how everyone in the room is doing. This first one is going to ask, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? And I'll give it just a couple moments for everyone to respond here. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll, share these results. All right, looks like optimism is in the lead. Always great to see. Definitely have some feelings of survival and anxiety in the audience as well. So hopefully our conversation will help with that a little bit today. I'm very confident it'll help alleviate some of those feelings. I'm going to stop sharing this poll and launch that second poll. What is keeping you up at night? Finance, sales, marketing, scale, pivot, team, or surviving? This one just helps us understand your current entrepreneurial needs a little better so that we can make sure we are providing relevant programming and resources to all of you. Awesome. We got folks from New York, Texas, Jamaica, Georgia, Virginia, New Jersey, DC, the Netherlands, Florida, Idaho, North Carolina, California. Welcome, welcome. Argentina. So great to have you all here with us today. Awesome. I'm going to end this poll and share these results. All right. Looks like finance in the lead, marketing, sales, and scale coming up behind. So thank you all for participating. Super helpful as we create more programming for all of you. So I'm going to stop sharing this poll. And without any further delay, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to our special guest, Lori Sussle Bonanni, founder and communications consultant at elssus LLC. Lori, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we jump straight into the conversation, could you maybe just give like 30 seconds about you?
Sure. I am a communications consultant. I build and grow companies' reputations to increase awareness, business results, and credibility. You can think of me as a non-traditional publicist. And that's me.
Awesome. Love it. Cool. So, I mean, we're here today to talk about, mindful communication and inclusivity. And so can you start by just describing how you would define inclusivity in the context of brand messaging, and why is it so crucial for businesses today?
So one of the examples, I give a talk called Who Are You Unknowingly Excluding? And the opening slide that I start with is a slide that says women in math. And the panel is for middle-aged white men. And so when you're talking about women in math, you're excluding perspectives from, ironically, women in math. And so the lack of awareness undermines the perspective of that entire event. And that's a great analogy to use in terms of your own brand messaging, being mindful of who your audience is and what the topics are and who's there. So there's lots of talk about manels, which are all male panels, and there's lots of different monikers for that. But
Mhm.
understanding your brand and who you're talking to, if people don't see themselves reflected in that messaging, you're probably missing the point.
Right, totally. And so diving a little bit deeper into that, that research into kind of just investing time and resources into really understanding who is your consumer, what are their needs, their desires, and how do you really communicate with them in a way that resonates. And so in that process, how can data analytics and consumer insights be leveraged to identify diverse consumer segments and tailor messaging to their specific needs?
So certainly surveys and focus groups and, talking to your consumer, incentives for feedback. Um, but knowing that those need to be accessible, right? If anybody can't actually give their feedback, you're missing out on an entire segment of people.
Right.
And so using those, getting that data and utilizing those insights and coming up with those strategies kind of goes back to, how do you communicate those questions in the first place?
Mm. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. So like that kind of, points to like specifically like the language that you're choosing in your communications. And so can you talk a little bit more about how language choice impacts inclusivity in messaging and what specific considerations should founders take into account when selecting words and phrases?
So words obviously matter. So we need to rethink derogatory and exclusionary words and phrases that may have been used in the past. So blind spot, tone deaf, powwow, best man for the job. And so thinking about those things, and I can send two links that you can include also in like the show notes. There's a modern dictionary that talks about the words and what are defined. It's called a self-defined dictionary. I'll send you a link and everybody can see what I'm talking about.
Awesome.
And the other one is how to evolve from like using violent language. So like um let me think, like let's not beat a dead horse, or I'll take a stab at it. Did we jump the gun? I'll bite the bullet. Like, how can you change those things to, I won't avoid it any longer, or let's just move forward, or what that might be. And so just softening that language a little bit also makes it easier to digest.
Absolutely. And what about when it comes to visual elements like images and graphics? How does that kind of like what considerations should entrepreneurs be taking into account when making those visual choices?
So using captions and subtitles and transcripts obviously helps those with hearing difficulties, but it also helps those who get distracted, um, who prefer to digest information, written information, or simply prefer to consume your content without the volume.
Hmm.
So, really taking into those considerations, it goes back to, the idea of curb cuts and the curb cut effect, which are, the cuts in the sidewalk that was originally designed to benefit, vulnerable groups such as, wheelchair users. And it ends up benefiting everyone. And so now it's easier with a stroller, or it's easier, for somebody on a bike, or what that might look like.
Right.
So really thinking about the design of things. I can send another link as well. But there's an entire graphic from this organization in the UK that says, if you're designing for people with low vision, these are the things that you need to be aware of. Or if you're
Yeah.
designing with people with ADHD, these are the things. And so there's been a lot written about that, but that's also a really, really helpful guide.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think this kind of touches on my next question and kind of just like thinking about the diversity among your consumers.
Mhm.
Um how can founders kind of navigate, the complexities of intersectionality in their communications and kind of find a balance between consumers that they're targeting who may have slightly varying needs?
So I think just like there are ramps in place in addition to stairs, design is that ramp for access. So thinking about if you have an event at, today at 3 o'clock Eastern, noon Pacific, what kind of things did people have to do to make sure they could be here? Or if you have a training event from your company and your company is accessible via public transportation, is that training facility also accessible via public transportation? And likening those things for founders to do for their own customers. How can you make it the simplest way to utilize, or promote your own product?
Mhm. Yeah. Absolutely. And so switching gears a little bit, I want to just talk about like some of the strategies that entrepreneurs can kind of employ, alongside their marketing or embedded in their marketing. So, just first off, what role does storytelling play in brand messaging and making it more inclusive? And how can founders incorporate diverse narratives into those brand stories?
So storytelling is key because I guess here's a good example. So when you see a press release, it's full of facts. It's meant for you to send to a journalist to tell a story.
Hmm.
And so when you read the press release versus a story, it's much more colorful. There's so much more background. You can sort of envision things, and it's not just dry information. And so that storytelling, you know, you don't want to lie or fake any of this, but if there is a diverse piece to tell that story, or if there are, segments of the population that could benefit from your company, utilize those stories. And how can you um, make that, you know, more make your audience more captive to want to understand um, what and where you came from, and what your product or company does.
Hmm. Yeah. I love that. And I think that's really important for consumers today and just like seeing themselves represented. So like, who better to kind of go to than the consumers themselves? So that's awesome.
And I
And
just want to add, if
yeah,
somebody picked this up, when I said your audience is captive, that's probably on the list of nonviolent language, and so like Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. So that definitely flagged me, if it flagged anybody else as well.
totally, totally. And so how can strategic partnerships with diverse influencers and thought leaders play a role in enhancing the inclusivity of your brand's messaging, especially for those, early stage businesses who are kind of in those, first few years of business?
So my first caution is to tread carefully, right? You don't want somebody's potential PR crisis to become yours because you've had a partnership. So that would be my first suggestion, is really vet that, and align some crisis pieces to this, and you don't want your brand to be tied to something. So that would be the first part of entering into any kind of partnership. But understanding what audiences that partnership opens up, right? The whole point of that is to get in front of other audiences. So like today, you and I are having a conversation. My audience is now expanded to your audience. And so
Right.
by borrowing another audience, you need to make sure that everything is in alignment, but that your stories, are capturing the audience of the other. And so that is one piece of it. But also going back, you don't want to borrow any trouble either by entering into any sort of partnerships that might not be so feasible.
Totally, totally. Yeah, it's a balance and definitely love the idea of kind of just like really investing the time and resources to ensure that it will be a valuable and sustainable partnership.
Yes.
Um, so, in kind of thinking about all of those consumers, different kind of segments that you may be communicating to, even potentially the audience of a strategic partner. What can founders do to effectively communicate their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusivity, belonging, and accessibility without it feeling like tokenism or performative activism? And I feel like this, part of it is just, having that brand messaging, that representation. But what are your thoughts here?
So here's an example. So when I
Mhm.
worked in advertising, I worked at DDB, which was a Madison Avenue agency. And when we would do new business pitches to organizations that may have been heavily influenced by a state's government, you had to answer questions. Where was your flooring sourced from? What do what is your visa and immigration status for your employees, and all of these different questions that seemed very invasive. I
Right.
would first make sure that all of the suppliers that you are utilizing have the same um, DEI goals that you do. So that would
Right.
be, in terms of vetting that, that would also go back to, avoiding borrowing crises. But I would make sure that, those suppliers that you use, the partners that you use, all have similar goals. And then I believe that was HubSpot had on their website a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still there, but they have a whole thing about, you know, while these are the things we're committed to, we are not, we're not where we want to be just yet. And sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so putting those goals out there and saying that this is, what our goals are and we're not there is really taking, that's a pretty ballsy move to be able to do that. Enacting it, of course, is even ballsier, but
Right.
that I think that's a really good start. But there's so many ways to, you know, if it's, whether it's a B Corp or, the NGO project, or, anything non-GMO project or any of those different ways that you can, further your commitment, I would
Mhm.
definitely take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, love that. And then, thinking about this kind of in the context of your internal team, maybe you have a couple people on your team if you're at that early stage, maybe you have an executive assistant, whatever it may be, a co-founder. You know, how can founders ensure that their entire team is aligned with and committed to the company's, um, you know, inclusive messaging goals?
I would put it in the job description. I would have it maybe something in a signature line in emails. I would have it around the office or on a Slack channel. And that's sort of your guiding light, right? So what are your missions and goals, and what are these focuses, and making sure that from the beginning anyone that's interviewing with you um, is on board with that, and that you don't find yourself with a problem later. But also knowing that these what else, if one of your commitments is giving back to the community, do people have to take time off to volunteer, or do you have a team effort doing something? And what does that actually look like when you put it into action? So like, you could say all you want and you could say all the right things that you want to say, but if you're not actions speak louder than words, and that's really the key piece of that.
Yep, absolutely. And so diving a little bit deeper into that, in kind of rallying your team around this mission for your business, what role does cultural competence kind of play in crafting that inclusive messaging, and how can founders ensure or support the development of this skill among their team members?
So as someone who's a big fan of research and also a big, my background, I've launched products into new markets. And so I've also on the corporate side worked with many companies outside of the US. And so doing, much like when you're traveling, and you're somewhere they don't speak English, like just showing that like you're trying, hello, thank you, please, that's important. But I think the other piece of it is what's the research around that? So early in my career, we were pitching Subaru and the executives were coming from Japan. And so, I was tasked with, find the cultural find the cultural pieces we should be aware of,
Right.
if people don't know. And so, understanding even when they give you your business card, they hand it with you with two hands. You're supposed to take it with two hands. You're supposed to look at it, but you don't shove it in your pocket. And so things like that, like understanding what that means and how it translates into your community, especially when you are working across cultures and, geographies.
Totally. Yeah. And so just staying on that point for a bit, you know, communication is hard and, definitely like sticking to that emphasis of language choice and visuals and just the way that you present yourself as a human. You can run into challenges if you don't necessarily do your research, or even if you do, it's just can be overwhelming. And so how can founders address the challenge of inclusivity in global markets where cultural nuances and sensitivities may vary significantly, and kind of support their team members in that process as well?
So I think one of my favorite ways to think about this in a broader context is, journalists use the who, what, where, when, why, how, for every foundation of every single story. And so by being able to answer those questions, kind of gives you a running start into the research for um, coming up with, what does that look like? But, maybe hiring people in those markets or having an advisor in those markets that are important to you. If you're not familiar with it, you know, you don't have to fake it till you make it. You find the
Yeah.
people that have that expertise in any capacity and hire them. That would be my suggestion there.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of like starting to look forward a little bit, just in the broader context of societal changes, how do you envision the impact of inclusive messaging on shaping cultural perceptions over time?
So I think one of the things is a lot of these lists, and I'll share them with you. It really gets you thinking in terms of what the language looks like and how language can be perceived. And I'm just talking like English language to each other, right? Like there's obviously so many more nuances, but really being able to understand, what does the recruitment and retention look like? If you're not implementing these things, are you, not being able to hire because you've missed certain of these points, or in your within your company, the whole point is, let's gain different perspectives, and what kind, more diverse teams bring in more revenue. And if everyone looks the same, are the perspectives all that different that they're looking at, and is the quality of these conversations and, launches and product market fit, like is that all really resonating to your intended audience?
Absolutely. And so then, looking ahead at the future of inclusive messaging, how do you kind of see the role of technology evolving, and what potential challenges should founders be aware of in their ongoing journey toward more inclusive messaging?
I think for sure openness to feedback, because something may resonate with you, but if somebody is, working on something and they're like, what, that doesn't sound right. And having that, cultural competence, what does that look like in terms of training and open conversations and having those diverse perspectives I mentioned. But you want this, depending on, an industry or what that looks like, what does that acceptance, look like? What does that local expertise look like, and this appreciation for diversity. So, if you're selling something to this audience, the Stanley Cups is a good example, right? They used to sell for, years and decades. They sold these cups to, people that, were working in construction. And so they, when they brought in influencers and they changed the colors of the mugs, now it's, people don't think twice when they can afford a $40, water bottle essentially. And it is a case study in, tweaking that customer audience, can bring in an entirely new revenue model. And so thinking about that in different ways, I'm sure one person didn't come up with that idea. It was, some testing and how can we open new markets and what could this potentially look like? And then, Target puts out this Valentine collection and there's a run in Target. So really just thinking about, who else can utilize that product, that service that you're offering, and how do you speak to them in their language?
Awesome. Love it. Laura, this has been such a great conversation, and we do have a bunch of time for Q&A from the audience. So if you are here in the audience and you have a question for Lori, make sure to drop it in that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try our best to get to all of them. So just to start off, you know, we obviously talked a lot about messaging and communication. And so kind of just thinking a little bit about like the brand identity itself, how could you kind of balance inclusive language with brand identity? So like thinking of the water company Liquid Death, for example, so like you kind of mentioned like the use of like violent languages, like how can like certain brands, kind of be an exception, or well, where does the line kind of get drawn?
I think this isn't a great answer, but I think it just depends. It depends on who that audience is and who you're talking to. Like, I think the line is drawn in different places for different products and services.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Got another question here. So is it this kind of about like, your communication style changing in different contexts? So like, you want to make sure that you're sounding that you are being authentic, but that, you're also resonating with the people that you're talking to. And so is it kind of better to like stay consistent across different communication platforms, like in the boardroom versus TikTok, or like have those kind of communication styles be more varied and kind of I'm guessing, it kind of depends on the audience here as well, but where do you kind of find that
Yeah.
balance?
So I would say, for example, we've shared a lot of emails back and forth and they were pretty formal. And before we went on today, we were having a much more casual conversation than the tone of our emails. So I think you can match the tone of your communication to the format. So, the language that's in a boardroom isn't necessarily what's going to be, on a TikTok. And so I think that can obviously depend that. And I think Twitter in its earliest forms was that, you had this many characters to do that. And you could include links, whereas on Instagram, there's your link in the bio and your way you're found is through your hashtags. Whereas LinkedIn might be a little bit longer form storytelling. So even thinking about those social channels in the way, it really tailoring that to its audience, whether you're Liquid Death or not, the messaging is definitely, once you have your style guide and you know what kind of language you use, you can adapt that across all of your platforms.
Absolutely. Love it. And so we have another question here. I think they're kind of asking about like your ICP. So, what are your kind of thoughts on developing an ICP to kind of better understand your target audience? And if so, are there like, kind of specific questions that you can ask to kind of like prompt, an answer and kind of better understanding who that person is, what their needs are, their desires, their, all those psychographic behaviors.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly not a bad idea to create that, the ICP in your avatar, but knowing that that is one version of who you're targeting, right? And so understanding the difference and understanding how you would communicate to those different audiences, as a writer and a communicator, if I saw 3 different ICPs, you're going to get 3 different ways that I would communicate with them and the language that would be. So, I'm not sure that is it recommended part, but yes, I think in terms of the guidance with the questions to create it, it's, obviously all the psychographic information, but also, where are they, and how can you best reach them is in terms of the communication piece, where are they, what are they listening to, what are they, all of that. But, where are they spending most of their time? Are they listening to NPR? Are they scrolling Instagram? Are they, listening to, the 5 o'clock news, watching the 5 o'clock news? Or are they getting all of their, news updates on an app, and thinking about it that way. So for example, years ago, I had a client and the audience was both elderly people and their caregivers. And so caregivers can range in a lot of age, and elderly, the level of comfort with technology was varied. But the messaging that was going to caregivers was at so many different levels because they were getting their information in so many different places, whereas like the typical like 85-year-old, which was like square in the middle of our audience, is not playing around on apps. So that was an interesting project. So thinking about like your primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences for certainly is helpful.
Yeah, I love that kind of breaking it down in that way. I think is great.
Yep.
So we have another question here. Any advice on how to communicate a strong, inclusive message in places that are maybe not as progressive or where DEI kind of gets a bad rap? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the language has to be, beat on your chest like we are, fully embracing DEI. I think just having that messaging and being able to, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. I think that's strong and powerful on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but what are some like concrete ways that founders can really gain meaningful feedback from their audience? Like surveys come to mind quickly, but I know a lot of founders, maybe not don't get great response rates. So how can you really get the insight that you need to make those continuous improvements?
Sure. So most of the work that I do is B2B. And so I'll start with that example. So, um, who are your partners and where might your product be sold? Can you get feedback from distributors? Can you get feedback from partners along the way in production? And then I think on the DTC, you're talking directly to your consumers, and there's obvious ways to get in touch with them. But I'm sure with the data and analytics that are on the back end, who's purchased, how many times have they purchased, when do they happen to purchase, if you see that they're only purchasing from your company on Black Friday, then like, okay, how can I engage with them at other points of the year? But I think being able to use language to request feedback in different ways is certainly an avenue for that.
Love it. Awesome. We have another question here. How valuable is using LinkedIn as a tool for startups to kind of like do that customer research? And like, I guess, how does inclusive messaging impact kind of your use of LinkedIn in the sense of maybe clarify. But I guess just thinking about like the value of using kind of social media community platforms as a tool to kind of better understand your customer. What are your thoughts there?
Sure. So I love research, as I mentioned before, and I think using LinkedIn as a tool to do that research is huge. People have their, most people have their professional hat on the platform, and you can get an idea of the posts that they engage with, posts that they, put out, and where their background was, what might align good. And I think LinkedIn has a really, I hate this word, but I think it makes sense. I think LinkedIn has a very robust tool to do a lot of searching, in terms of finding ideal customers in the B2B space, certainly.
Yeah, awesome.
So optimize your profiles in case somebody's looking for you.
Yes. Definitely. And so I think this kind of goes into, maybe confidence or even just like communication and in front of other people. But what is kind of like the best way to like practice, the way that you communicate with others, and kind of like test those grounds, so that you're ensuring that while the messaging is coming through, you genuinely do come through as authentic as well. Maybe it's, just getting right out there and talking straight to the customer. What are your thoughts here?
So I think that a good example is, when you're looking to expand your customer base, is your communication mindful and effective, or are you just creating a bigger bubble? And so going back to my journalistic framework, asking yourself, who do you want to speak with and who are you actually speaking to? What are you saying, and is the language inclusive? Where are you reaching these potential customers, and are you on sites that align with your, initiatives, including partners? When are you getting back to customers? What does your social media timeline look like? I will not name this brand, but I bought something maybe a month ago, and I have sent multiple customer service emails, and they go 7-8 days without being responded to. And so this is a brand that I know is well loved and people admire, and this product was not cheap, and I am so put off by their lack of communication. And I'll ask like two questions, and there, without going into all that, I'll ask like a question or two, and I've never had to like do this with a brand. Like, I
Right.
received this product, there was some issues, and I just feel like I'm going through like these like, you know, different kinds of questions. Like, why am I asking so many questions? Just answer me in one email. Like
Right.
this is not it's not rocket science. And I feel like I'm like so turned off by like this brand that people adore and love and was not inexpensive. And so, that's giving me a really bad impression of them. And so let's go back. Where was I? I think when are you getting back to these customers? And when did you say you would? Do you have an auto reply that says we answer calls between 9 and 6 Pacific? And why are you communicating is really important. So being clear and concise. And then ultimately, how do you ensure your communication reaches its intended audience? And so really look at that communication and, ask and answer these questions honestly, get feedback from your team, because I think the benefits, are clear in terms of, you know, acquisition of new clients, even
Right.
recruiting and retention, recruiting and retaining your team. And then, of course, financial Harvard Business Review had found that more diverse companies report, I think, nearly 20% higher revenue. So,
Well,
really thinking about those things is super important. And I know that was a long winded question, and I could write a case study on what not to do with this other company, but I would definitely make sure that if people are reaching out to you, that's such an easy like softball in terms of, how to make a good impression.
totally. Love it. So you mentioned the dictionary. Are there any other resources that startups can use to just like stay up to date with language and other communication trends and best practices?
Yes, I will send you those 3 links, and if I can think of any more, I will absolutely, we can pop that into the YouTube link. But
Awesome.
I think people will really appreciate the 3 things that I'll send. I think there's a lot of information just even there to dive into for sure.
Perfect. And so can you maybe like, do you have any examples of brands that have, integrated storytelling like really well into their, image, and their communications?
Dove is always comes top of mind. I think that they do amazing work. Nike, these are obviously big companies, but I think that those are opportunities to look at like who's doing things really well. And we won't name companies that aren't, but
Sure.
I think, looking at, even if it's not in your industry, like what are the things that, keep like a running, a Notion or some kind of, Google Doc or something. And if something's really great, mark that down and make that something that's part of your SOP. And on the flip side, if something is really not good, put that on there too. I see Alana's chat. So, however they treated you, like make sure like this is in our, operating procedures. These are things we do not do with customers, and
Mhm.
being able to see that, in other examples. So you're not starting from scratch. Like, what are your favorite companies? What do they do? And how do they make you feel, loved as a customer and valued?
Mhm. Awesome. Um, Thinking a little bit more about, strategic partners or, just any institution that you may work with. We talked a little bit about like the risks associated with that, and kind of how that can impact your business.
Mhm.
But in kind of doing that research and thinking about like who you want to work with to elevate your brand, in balancing like your values, what criteria can founders kind of look to, in kind to ensure that those partnerships are authentic and inclusive?
That's a good one. I like that. Um, I think looking at the company's background as a partner, looking at what does their executive team look like? Does it look like the kind of company that has similar values, and are they aligned? You know, like if you're an employee interviewing somewhere and you don't look like everybody else, like are you going to feel welcome and that you belong? Like it's sort of the same way, like you're interviewing these potential partners or suppliers, do you feel like, what you offer is going to be valued, or is that something that they just have as so low of a priority that it might not make sense? And then, you know moving on to the next one and seeing what that looks like. And I know there's financial pieces to all of this, but I think, going back, one of the things that, I've run into time and time again are, companies partnering with another company or acquiring or merging or whatever the case is, and then having a crisis on their hands because there were values that were not aligned or clear early on. And so the company that is not the offender is guilty by association anyway. So
Yeah.
really doing homework and making sure that people are on the same line, and going to communication there, open and honest communication. Like if this happens, what would your reaction be? Or if this were to occur, you know what would your team do? Like, and having those scenarios and thinking that through, because that's a really important piece of that. And so just making sure that everyone is on the same line, because also on executive leadership teams, I see this all the time. There's lots of different opinions. So making sure that the right people are in the room, and, not like, oh, I blew off that meeting, kind of thing. It's like, these are the key stakeholders and there has to be alignment. And this is the team that's doing that, and not, oh, well, I didn't agree to it, I wasn't in the room, kind of thing. You're the
Right.
leadership and you're figuring that out, and you are part of that, and that's a hugely important and piece of that.
Totally. And so kind of going off of that, and this is a little bit about the founder specifically. How important is it to kind of like be the face of the company, and how does that impact, the effectiveness of your communication, or not.
So that's a good one because founders are not necessarily the CEO later on, right? And so having, about our team, those pages are really important, and who has the visibility on those pages. So if you are the founder and the CEO, you should absolutely be visible. If you are the founder and you've, sold off and you're stepping away, I think an example here might be Lululemon, and their founder, has had many communication missteps in the past and recently. And so they are separate entities, the founder and the company. And so really thinking through what that ultimately looks like in terms of, are you pushing the founder away? Are they still very much part of it? And in most opportunities that, I've been part of, it's really split 50-50. So again, the answer is it depends.
Yeah, no, totally. But that's how it goes. That's great. We have another interesting question here.
Sure, keep them coming.
Um, when B2B marketing to larger firms, what suggestions do you have kind of for your outbound marketing messaging, to kind of reduce or alleviate their concerns, with working with a smaller firm who maybe has more limited business history?
So I don't love name dropping, but this is a time to do that. I think also um, we're all inundated with spam. So making it personable communication, don't let it look like, an AI bot wrote something and that had no human eyes were on it. Going back to research, I can't tell you how many times I get, these spam emails about we can get you and your company PR. And it's like, well, I do PR. I do that.
Right.
So you're not even spending your time and money on, reaching the right people. And I think, having, and you can tell, in terms of spam, like I get like, "Oh, I love what you're doing in your industry," or like, "That just," like, if you really love, like, "What am I doing?" And being specific and having that background, that information, and case studies would be huge for this particular question. So, what suggestions? It's like, well, companies like X, Y, and Z trust us, or, the benefit of working with a small firm is that, it's not getting farmed out, or this is the team. I've worked with a lot of startups. I've worked with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and I've been the outbound person and I've been the recipient of the outbound. And I think that making it personable, making it human, but also relying on that name dropping of companies so that it's oh, okay, I get it. And myself as an entrepreneur does that, right? So I've worked with plenty of startups that, people haven't heard of. I've worked with plenty of
Right.
startups people have, but I can also say I've worked at NBC, I've worked at, Verizon, and I have the name value. And that can pretty much help in terms of that outbound. But doing that marketing, one of the best ways is, introductions and personal referrals and recommendations. So I wouldn't discount the, hey, Michelle, I see we're connected to so and so on LinkedIn, and or you're connected, and this is what I would love to share with them. Would you mind checking with them, and seeing if you might be able to make an introduction, and
Yeah.
um, or if not, could you give me any background that I couldn't find online about this person so I can reach out directly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love it. That's
Cool.
super helpful. So in kind of thinking about, bridging cultural gaps, um, how can entrepreneurs kind of use technology in this area of their messaging, like kind of on a global scale, when potentially interacting with international clients? How can technology specifically kind of be that bridge?
Oh, that's such a big question. I'm going to go with it depends on there, but I think that being able to ensure that, I mean, look at, March of 2020, how many people can say they were using Zoom before 2020? Like,
Right.
and now it's, a household name. Like my mom has a Zoom account. So
Yeah.
I think being able to utilize technology in a way that helps and not hinders, what does that actually mean? Or, is there something that you need to, do to make sure that it aligns, globally? I think I need a deeper example of that to really answer it, but I would say don't fear technology.
Mhm.
Um, and so that would be helpful there.
Yeah. Love it. I think we have time for a couple more
Okay.
questions. We have a
Yeah.
really interesting one coming in here. And it's kind of regarding, really getting at like the nitty-gritty of like what is going through the heads of consumers. So, it's difficult. It can be difficult to kind of get past like the surface level conversation. And what is like your advice on kind of like helping people feel comfortable enough to actually share their truth with you?
All right. You've stayed on for 52 minutes. You're going to get one of my secret weapons when I do outreach. Google the person. Google News their company. What's happened recently that when you reach out, you can reference that versus hope you're well, because we have no idea if people are well, or, hope you had a nice weekend. We have no idea what's going in their personal world, but we can find out what's going on in their businesses. And so I would Google their company. I would Google their name. I would Google the CEO, the leadership team, and find something that is relevant that has been in the news or a recent blog post or something that they've even posted on their LinkedIn, and tap into that to do the outreach.
Mm,
Great feature in the New York Times last week. Or, it doesn't even need to be that big, really appreciated that blog that was on your website, back in February. And I'm reaching out because I have an opportunity that aligns with that now. And this is why.
right.
But I think the hope you're well, like, it just is painful to hear. So I think really being creative about that and showing that you, back to my favorite word, doing that you did your research and that you are able to have that conversation.
Absolutely.
That brings it, a little better. So that brings it, to be a little more mindful and genuine.
Yeah, love it. So I think we have time for one more question. We've talked a lot here, a lot of different strategies. What are your tips on kind of measuring the success of your communication strategy, and um, how can you really ensure that like, your goals are being met according to, the communications that you like your goals have been set according to like the communication style that you are executing among your consumer base. So, just what are your thoughts on measuring success in that area?
Sure. So at the outset, you have to set goals so that they can be measured. And one of the benefits of communication is, you're not like writing it in concrete. And so, if it's not working, change it. And using, earlier on those questions about, getting feedback from your customers, your partners, your internal teams, your leadership team, your investors, what does that look like? And if something's not working, fix it, like we're not doing, heart surgery that, it's irreparable or something. It's really, let's fix it. What's going on with that communication? And, even auditing the past communication, what's worked, what hasn't, we've sent out 100 emails, which are the ones that have really resonated, which are the ones that are really not great, what do those subject lines look like? Doing a lot of A/B testing and just seeing what the communication has looked like in the past can certainly help figure out how to communicate moving forward. And those audits, do it internally, hire somebody, but being able to see, what you've, what are you putting out and what are people picking up really? What is that messaging that's resonating? Asking, your customers. And in fact, this is one of the questions on a questionnaire I give to a potential client. It's, what do you do? What problem does your company solve? And I get like really, really long-winded answers. And then I say, how do you explain it to your grandma? And, then it's totally clear. And it's like, well, then talk like that to your customer, because they're hiring you because they don't have that level of expertise and they're hiring you for that. So what does that mean? And if I went back years of these answers, it's like sometimes, that even becomes their tagline, because
Yeah.
it's so easy to understand when you think about, well, how do you explain it to somebody that doesn't know? Or, what does that look
Yeah.
like? And it doesn't have to be your grandma. It could be, how would you explain it to a 5-year-old? And so that's been really interesting too.
Love it. Awesome. Lori, this has been an incredible conversation. If you had just one key takeaway or piece of wisdom that you wanted to leave with the audience, what would that be?
I think the key takeaway is communication really matters, and a lot of thought needs to go into it. And it's not just something you like whip up 10 minutes before it needs to go out, and really thinking about, what is the implication of that communication? What is the call to action? Is that clear? What does that look like? And going back and asking the 5 W's and an H, does this communication answer those questions? That would be my key takeaway.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lori, on behalf of the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today. We're just so thankful that you joined us and shared your insights.
Thank you so much. This was really great. And thank you for having me. And thank for everybody that is watching live or will watch later. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. And to our audience, we would love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars, which you can view using that link that's going to be posted in the chat. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.